Welcome back to another episode of SuperCoach, mates. In today's episode, we're going to be analysing some forward options and comparing them, seeing if they're worthy of being in our teams. So the first options we've got at the moment are Zach Butters and Stephen Cornelio, both relatively popular options, not as much as some of the others, but how about you, Tom? Do you have any of these two in your team, and if so, which one?
Yeah, I've got Cornelio at the moment. I initially didn't have him purely because I couldn't fit him, but now I've pulled some strings together and gotten him in, which is good because I think it goes one or two ways. Because obviously now they've lost the likes of Hopper and Taranto, so there's now room for him and Tom Green to really flourish. On the downside, I guess if you're playing devil's advocate, the risk is that he might get tagged out of a few games just because, there's not many other GWS players going around two tags, so it's one or the other, really. So it'll be interesting to see who they go for. I think the benefit with Cornelio, he can sneak into the forward line a bit, and hopefully it's not a permanent fixture, but at least he can play predominant midfield. And we know how good he is in the midfield. So as you can see there, the highest score was 174, and that was when he was playing pure mid. So yeah, he's a very good footballer, and I think he found his form later in the season last year. But yeah, I'd go him ahead of Butters. I was a Butters owners last year. I don't know if you were, Jonas, but he's one that I think the risk with him is every year he gets touted that he's going to play full-time mid. But the risk that you run with him is his body, I don't think, just doesn't hold up to play full-time mid. He always gets nicked up. He's a pretty small player, so unless he significantly puts on kilos in the preseason, he just gets bumped around too much. And as soon as he has an issue, he kind of reverts back into the forward line to kind of rebuild his body a bit, and then scores suffer a fair bit. So I think I'd rather stay away from the Port boys in Rozee and Butters for now until I see consistency, because as we all know, with Ken Hinkley's coaching decisions can be a bit rash sometimes. And we saw that with Rozee last year when he played predominantly forward and then got flipped in the mids for a couple of weeks and went back forward. So I think Cogs is the way to go for me if you had to pick between the two. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I also have Cornelio, but I don't mind the Butters pick. He is a bit more of a point of difference, and he finished the year off really strongly. He didn't go under 100 for the last 5 games. He certainly has a ceiling. I remember a few years ago, I think he was on over 100 at halftime before being injured. And then also this year in round 14, he was on 68 SuperCoach points against Sydney in 28 minutes of game time. So essentially a quarter. So he has a huge ceiling. The only issue with Butters, as you're saying, is the way he plays is so reckless that he's almost bound to cop some sort of injury and either be sent forward or just miss a week or two. He missed a few weeks last year. And on top of that, he has the tendency to throw in a few 50s. He scored a 58, a 57, a 58, and a 52 throughout stages of last year. So that sort of lack of consistency does concern me a bit. So for me, I prefer Cornelio because his lack of consistency was purely based on the fact that he was playing up forward at times.
Yeah.
And now I don't think he'll be spending too much time there now with some of the exits of Taranto, Hopper, and Tanner Bruin. So he should see a fair bit of midfield time and probably average around at least 100. Plus, he has a really soft opening month of football. So if you're not starting him, I don't understand why you'd be having the idea of bringing him in halfway through the season after he's played some of these comfortable teams. So he's one I'd rather start with and sort of hope that he banks some really good scores early and then just continues on that way. And with Butters, also you have to think about Horne-Francis and see how many mid-minutes he takes away from Butters. Having said that, that could also affect Rozee, but we'll talk about that a bit later on. But yeah, in essence, Cornelio for me, but I wouldn't hate the idea of going Butters.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think it's a tight one, and I think Cornelio is probably the more consistent out of the two across a a larger sample size. But I guess moving on to the next group of players, which includes the next fourth player in Connor Rozee. Obviously at a cheaper price point, I guess another player that's at that price point even cheaply is Tim Taranto, who I think I've seen on social media that he's primed to play pure mid alongside Hopper. It seems like those two are going to be permanent fixtures in that midfield group, plus I guess a Shai Bolton or a Dusty Martin rotating through. Have you got one of those two in your side, or do you have both, or what are your reasons around having them in at the moment?
So at the moment, I've got both of them. I think Taranto is essentially a must-have, whereas Rozee presents good value given some of the forward scores he had at the start of the year priced into his average. But with Taranto, I think he's entered a prime age bracket. He's moved clubs. He's going to have permanent mid-minutes at GWS. He certainly wasn't one of the main top 3 CBA players. So there's certainly upside there. On top of that, he's relatively durable, and I can only see him improving that average. Cochin's going to be out of the midfield. Prestia's body is touch and go all the time. So I think him and Hopper will stand out. On top of that, he's had a really good preseason. Won, I think, back-to-back time trials. So, yeah, for me at 500k, he's a top 6 lock. I'll just be getting him and not worrying about that. Whereas Rozee is also good, but again, with Horne-Francis coming in, I'm not sure if that's going to affect his CBAs. But having said that, Eamon's left the team, and Boak's going to be moving out of there. So I only see upside in Rozee as well, but slightly less, and he is a tiny bit more expensive, so hence Taranto. But how do you see it? Do you also have Taranto ahead of Rozee?
Yeah, I mean, I've got Taranto in the side purely based on the fact that whilst he's known to butcher the ball a fair bit, I think he'll get enough of it at Richmond to justify his scoring. He's obviously cheapest out of the whole bunch of them at that 500 to 550 range, which is nice, and seems to have dominated preseason so far. And I think he knows he's going to be one of the head honchos in that midfield. I don't have Rozee at the moment purely based on the fact that I've obviously got the 3 premium forwards up front, and the other one is Cogs, and obviously everyone's got Dunkley, so haven't been able to squeeze him in. I think I initially had Rozee ahead of Cogs on a price thing, but then I managed to squeeze Cogs ahead just to get that 40k somewhere, get the 40k from somewhere else. But yeah, Rozee obviously showed, I think it was that patch, I know it included the game against St Kilda, but he had that patch around that middle of last year where he just played pure mid and dominated like crazy. So I think it's as soon as we realise that Ken Hinkley's willing to play in pure mid, he's one that I think the difference between him and Butters, he's one that can last a full season in the midfield because he's quite dynamic and doesn't go headfirst into tackles like Butters does. So he's one that I think can last the season more predominantly over Butters. But I guess the risk that you're on with Rozee is his fluctuation of scores is quite drastic. Especially when he has a poor game, even in the midfield. But more worryingly, if they're down on forwards and he needs to go forward, it's a bit of an issue. But I'd probably pick, if I had to be forced my hand and pick one out of the two, probably pick Tim Taranto. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward with Horne-Francis coming in, because Horne-Francis is one of 2 options. He plays in the half forward line or he plays pure mid. If he does play pure mid and he dominates there, I think that's risky for Butters and Rozee, because one of them will rotate through the half forward line, and especially someone like Rozee, his scores suffer when he's playing half forward. He's not kicking 3 goals a game. But it's just one of those things where we're almost at that stage now where we're ready to go and see what happens in preseason. I think a first batch of preseason games are next week or the week after, I believe.
Next week.
Next Friday. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, 24th, I think. Collingwood and Carlton, and then St Kilda St Kilda Melbourne or something, I think it's on the 24th at RSC Park. So, we'll definitely find out by then. It's creeping up pretty quick, but yeah, we have got to wait and see, I think, with what the rotation looks like with who's in that midfield for Port, because they've obviously added a few, but as you said, they've lost a few as well.
Just
Yeah,
quick,
maybe on. Oh
those
yeah, we'll
boys, just
say.
to add on, I think the addition of Lysett, because he didn't play much last year, is only bound to help. They had Finlayson trying to tap down to them, so they should get at least more opportunity to get first look at the ball.
Yeah.
So I think that's an addition. But having said that as well, there are a few Port midfielders in there, like Ollie Wines, obviously, who doesn't really play anywhere else, and Drew. So that's something also to be mindful of because, yeah, if you got those four plus Horn Francis, someone's going to be spending some time on the bench or half forward. So something just to keep an eye on.
Oh yeah, 100%. But again, I guess moving on to two more premiums that I guess are not being spoken about in the vein that the other 4 or 5 have is Isaac Heaney and Dylan Moore. I think Isaac Heaney is one that obviously people didn't look too fondly upon last year because of how many times they'd burnt previous owners, but he's up there at the pretty expensive price point, and I guess his average reflects that. He did have batches of games where he dominated. Dylan Moore is one which is kind of interesting, where no one really expected it, and I guess if he jumped on ship for whatever reason quite early, and you were rewarded quite handsomely because he ended up being basically a top 6 forward, even though I think a lot of people didn't expect him to do that, but he just kept performing week in, week out, got his 30 disposals and 1 or 2 goals, and that translated pretty kindly. But I think, first of all, do you have any of these in your team? But second of all, do you reckon there is merit to kind of going a bit different with these two in particular, or it's not worth the risk?
In my opinion, it's not worth the risk going for a point of difference here with the forward premiums. There's some really obvious standout options. And with both of these players, they appear to be playing predominantly forward, especially Heaney. So whilst they'll have stints in the midfield and score well in games or go up forward and kick goals, to me, I'd rather be picking those players who are guaranteed pure mid-minutes, and neither of these two options will be getting that, in my opinion. Particularly not Heaney, potentially more a bit. But having said that, you've got a few players at Hawthorn who are ahead of him in terms of getting mid-minutes purely because they can't really play anywhere else. So for me, both of these are a pass. If I had to pick one, I'd go Dylan Moore, though. He's not injury prone. He's got the upside of potentially playing more mid-time. And I think he's entering a nice age bracket. But in saying that, he's playing for Hawthorn. They're not going to win many games. If he's spending time up forward and they're a bottom 4 side, that's only going to mean bad things for him. So both these picks have some pretty obvious downsides that I'm not loving. But do you look fondly on either of these two?
Probably not, just because I think you've got a clear 4 to 5 candidates ahead of them. I think, yeah, the risk with Heaney is obviously injury concern, and the fact that the likes of Warner, Goulden, who we'll talk about a bit later, are getting into that prime era for midfielders, and I think they prefer Heaney up forward. I think I mentioned previously in last year's kind of batches of podcasts during the actual season, having watched a few Sydney games, I don't think Heaney's actually that good of a midfielder. He's a much better half forward and dominates games off that, and someone that actually does quite well pushing into the contest from half forward. So he's one that I think I'd rather pass on. Maybe if it was 450k, it'd be a different story, but 550 is very high for that. Dylan Moore, on the other hand, yeah, I think he's one that I think everyone that played SuperCoach for the full year kind of was almost like, oh, is he worth it? Is he not? And every week he'd pump out another 100, and he was kind of a little too late for that. And I think paying $521 for him is just not worth it. I think I read somewhere or saw somewhere on social media that he's been training up half forward, but he's still getting plenty of ball. So it seems like a very similar mould to Heaney in the fact that he'll start half forward, push forward into the midfield, and it's basically a spare, because they seem to like the ball in his hands because he's a goal scoring threat. But I think with him, it's just not worth it at $521 anymore when you've got the likes of Rozee, Butters, Taranto even cheaper, and Dunkley only 30k more. So yeah, I just don't think it's worth it anymore. But you could do worse than picking him, because with Hawthorn's situation at the moment in a rebuilding phase, anyone as experienced and as well versed as him is going to do well. I think just because they're going to get enough ball in his hands, unless he gets tagged out of games. which he well might. But I guess moving on to 2, I know that you've got one of these players in your ruck line, but below 500k, I guess, is a bit of a riskier move because you're not guaranteed points. But I guess 2 that we've got pitted head to is one is a ruck forward in Darcy Cameron, and the other one's Errol Goulden, who I think was probably 1 year too early last year, if you were agreeing saying in regards to any breakout consistency-wise. But similar averages, and obviously you've got to disregard Cameron's poor scoring early in the year as a key forward rather than a key ruck. But what are your thoughts on either of those? Do you have any merit in picking? I know you've got Cameron in the ruck, which will be a point of discussion, but what are your thoughts on Errol Goulden as well as a potential? If you do want to save money and maybe need money to get from Tom Mitchell to like a Jack McRae, would you save that in the forward line just because of the lack of consistent scoring for many of the forwards, or what are your thoughts on those 2?
Goulden's a strange one because you look at his scoring last year, he's got a lot of hype, but he still scored under 100 16 times last year, which is obviously far too many times. So you really, at that price, you're paying obviously for a keeper and you're hoping he averages 100, 105, which I don't believe he can do just yet because I don't think he's going to get enough mid minutes to do that. You've got Parker still in there, Warner, Rowbottom, Mills will pinch it in there. So there's plenty of mouths to feed in that midfield. So for me, Errol is a pretty easy pass. He'll have his good games, but yeah, some of his scoring last year was not very impressive. For instance, he scored 52 against North Melbourne. So for me, it's a bit of a no-go. Perhaps next year, when Mills maybe spends even less time in there and Parker's out of there. But for now, yeah, he's probably a pass. As for Cameron, I like the DPP flexibility. He had some hamstring concern, but he's back in full training. He might share ruck time with Cogs. But
yeah, well, that was my next question. Were you worried about, obviously when Cameron was rucking fully with running down, he obviously was scoring consistent hundreds, but I guess he almost, I don't know, as a comment to put his name a lot more than I would, but what are your thoughts on that ruck split? Do you think that Cox will be a consistent fixture just because they have the luxury of 2 ruckmen, which I think is becoming a more predominant thing in the AFL at the moment, having to need two rucks, or you think that it's more of a dependent on the matchup? Say they're playing Melbourne with Iguan and Grundy, and they physically need a bigger body to help Cameron out, or do you think it's one of those things that'll be whittled out in pre-season?
I think we'll find out a lot in pre-season, but personally, I think Cameron is firmly entrenched in our best 22 and Cox is on the edge and might come in for games when we've got, say, Fremantle or Melbourne where we need him as well. I'm pretty comfortable in backing Cameron to lift that average to at least 95 and at worst case being like an F7 R3 swing come end of the year. And sort of just a pick at the moment where worst case, say he holds the average of 85, I'm paying a lowish price and I get to see who's the clear R2 ruck that I want with Marshall. So for me, I'm pretty comfortable selecting him. Players have their preseason niggles. We saw last year Dawson, for instance, right until round 1, I believe he had that calf complaint but managed to play and ended up being one of the top defenders. So I'm not too concerned. And I firmly disagree with any notion that he'll get subbed out of a game purely because we don't need him, because Cameron's incredibly versatile in the sense that he can go up forward, take a nice clunk, kick a goal here, and rest forward, or play in the ruck and pinch it with McStay. So for me, he's still in my team at the moment with the news of English having some more injury problems. He's got concussion problems and soft tissue. So, I mean, Cameron, he had that hamstring strain, so that might sound a bit I might be contradicting myself a bit there, but he's back to full training and he doesn't have any real significant injury history. So I think it'll be a decent pick and one where you can sort of just almost play like keepings off and just sort of hold your ground and figure out the ruck environment and landscape and try and ascertain who the best ruck is. Because it certainly might be English injury, and it could be someone like Grundy if he's playing 90% ruck time or something, or Darcy, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think it's too hard to say, and I think all the clear rucks that were been in the previous years have now been double ups with, like, you got Darcy Jackson, Gordon Grundy, and things like that. And obviously English is a walking hospital, which doesn't help. And I think with him, like, as an owner, I obviously jumped on too late last year, so I don't really reap the benefits early on. But yeah, watching him play, I think once he kind of loses out of that hit out to advantage, just didn't get around the ground as best as he could when he's not injury free. And he always has some sort of niggle, I think, and obviously with his concussion stuff, it's something you've got to be really careful of. So I think the risk of him missing it, if he gets a concussion, he's more likely to miss 2-3 weeks than 1 week just because of his history. But I guess, yeah, time will tell with the rucks. But moving on to two potential breakout candidates who are priced extremely cheaply for what they're potentially capable of. Obviously, one in my guys in Marcus Windhager, who is predominantly training with the mids at the moment. Whether or not it'll be deployed as a tag is yet to be seen. But obviously, the other one, Oscar Allen, who actually didn't have a bad couple of years beforehand with regards to consistent, 60s to 70s, price at 210, which is basically a high expensive rookie. Didn't play at all last year, but with the retirement of Kennedy and, injury clouded Jack Darling. What are your thoughts on those two? I know Sam Flanders is someone that I forgot to actually put on here, but he'll be, I guess, in this conversation of these three. What are your thoughts on them three in particular? Could you have more than one, or is it not worth the risk, or is anyone sticking out, including Flanders, I guess, to put at, F4, F5? What are your thoughts on those three in particular?
Yep. I'll let you speak a bit more about Windhager because I don't have a great read on him. I know he was deployed a bit as a tagger last year and his average reflects that. But apparently he's been having a really good preseason and is potentially like the Saints' second to third best mid. So there is a bit of upside there. But with Allen, I don't mind the pick, but he is a key forward playing for West Coast, Darling potentially injured. Whilst he's been performing well at preseason in the intra-club matches, he's also been playing against other West Coast players. So it's tough. If you're picking Allen, are you then also going with King? Because if you're weighing up Allen and King, I'd rather pick King purely because you're saving 35,000. King's going to get a lot more of the ball, and King also has Chol and Casbolt there to sort of keep the opposition's defense busy and not tag team him. So,
100%.
For me, it's a bit of a tough decision. I know Allen is almost a good option because he's going to be playing the whole game, not being subbed out. His best 22, etc., etc. But he's going to score some really low scores, and you're going to hope that he's early on in the year he kicks a bag of 5 or 6 and really ignites that cash generation. But if he doesn't, he'll be a very slow burn. And if you've got him on field and he scores you a 35, you're far behind the 8 ball. So for me, both of these at the moment are a bit dodgy options. I want to see Windhager's role in the preseason match, and if he does really well, he'll be tempting. It's the exact same with Flanders, a lot of hype, but you want to see it first. So if I had to pick one right now, I'll probably play the safe game and pick Allen in the sense that he's 50k cheaper, but that could change very quickly if Windhager puts in a good shift. But yeah, what about you? What are your thoughts on Windhager?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I was big on him. I purely moved him on at the moment just down to a rookie because I wanted to kind of work it with 3 premium defenders. But the more I look at it, the more I want to revert back to having a stronger F4. Having said that, Allen, I think I'll pass just because he's obviously one of the 2 main key forwards. And with Darling's injury concern, if there's any chance, I mean, it's a tough one because I think if Allen plays second fiddle to Darling, it's actually not too bad because he gets the second defender. But as soon as he gets the first defender, I think it speaks volumes of how poor his scoring will turn out to be. And there's no guarantee that even though he's playing second fiddle, he will score that well to justify his price. He obviously be relying on goals. But it would have been good to see him as a third forward consistently last year because, it would have helped to see his scoring. But, yeah, he's one that I think will be interesting to see because he's definitely capable of scoring 5 to 6 goals. But I think, as you said, King's a bit more favourable, 50k cheaper or whatever is 40k cheaper. And Gold Coast look to have been having a really good pre-season, which has been nice. Moving on, Flanders, similar thing. It's too hard to say with his Gold Coast players. I think there's always a lot of hype around them, but none of them really scored that well in general, other than Took Miller and Jared Witts, and maybe odds, Noah Anderson and things like that. And obviously Rao Windhager, obviously because St Kilda supporter, he was obviously used as a tagger midway from last year, which was Brett Ratton's decision to move into a tagging role, which he obviously superbly well. But obviously impacted his scoring, as you can see, barely averaged a 50, and had a tendency to basically score some stinkers. But he's one that was purely a tagging role and nothing else. And I guess learning from the best midfielders in the comp doesn't translate well into SuperCoach scoring. But he's one that apparently has been training really well. And it seems like, I know I spoke or messaged Shane's TV on one of his videos and asked him what is his thoughts on Windhager, considering he's been down training a couple of times. And it seems like they're looking to play him as a full-time mid, which if that's the case, I think he's capable of doing a very Petrarca role where he's capable of going forward and kicking goals and getting his, 20-odd possessions, and he's a tackle machine as well. So I think the one thing he was lacking from last year was his potential to score big because of his lack of possessions, because he was following him around. But we also, doesn't take long to realise that Ross Lyon had Quinton Jones back in the day, who was a pure tagger, and he liked that role. And there was obviously a few role players, so he could be, still very role-oriented. It's hard to tell. But I think for now, I'd say you're pretty mildly confident picking him to score all right. It'd be him or Flanders, I think, for me, with that price tag. But I think I'd go Windhager just ahead, just because, as a St Kilda supporter, I'd enjoy watching him play. But from what I've seen in glimpses when he's asked to take his own ball, he's ridiculously talented, and he's very Petrarca-esque in the way that he plays, and he's strong around the hips and all that. So, it'd be a good score, I think, if he gets that license to roam.
And looking at St Kilda's fixture, they've got a moderately difficult one. They've got Fremantle, Bulldogs first up, and Essendon. Caldwell will probably go to Steele. And then Gold Coast. So that's a sort of tough opening month. And then they've got Collingwood, which is good. Carlton, sort of difficult. Port Adelaide, pretty difficult. And North Melbourne and Adelaide. So it isn't the friendliest of fixtures. So you're backing him to really stand out in that midfield rather than have easy kills. But in saying that, I wouldn't let the fixture deter you too much. If he's playing well in the intra-club and pre-season matches, shouldn't really change how he goes in.
No. I mean, Steele's the number one man there. So if there's any tagging issues, Steele's the one that gets tagged out of games. But obviously, you've got to take into consideration that you've got a midfield originally of Seb Ross, Brad Crouch, and Steele. You've also got Gresham in there, provides the X factor element. So who knows what the midfield combination's like. I know for the forward line structure, I know Machida Owens looks like to be playing, second or third tall at the moment, as a 191 key forward because of our injury crisis. And we've just signed that Caminiti bloke. I think he played for Carlton's VFL team, or honestly, I'm not too sure where he played at. But he seems to be a pretty decent option. So I don't think there's any risk of Windhager moving forward. Like on a half forward line, I think he'll be exposed pretty early into the midfield. It's just whether or not he'll be asked to deploy as a tagger, which is obviously their risk because he does it so well. But hey?
Did he play predominantly as a tagger last year? Did he have stints up forward or in the back line?
No, he started off in the half forward line, and it was halfway through when they deployed him as tagger, and then from then on in, it was a full-time tagging role. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Ross Lyon as a different coach. But I guess moving forward to our last batch of forwards before we put a bonus kind of who would you pick from one of our social media followers? But yeah, mid prices. Final one, which is an interesting one, I guess, because I mean some talk about them online and on around the whispers of SuperCoach. Yeah, Ben Long has obviously moved to the Gold Coast, which is an interesting move. I know St Kilda fans weren't too happy of that one because he literally played his best game of his career in the very last match of the season against Sydney, where he scored that 142 as a half backman. And Jason Horne-Francis, who obviously was clearly in need of a fresh start, and it seems like it's been training pretty well with Port Adelaide. If he gets that mid spot, who knows what he's capable of, because I mean, we all know that he's capable of scoring hundreds, but it was just a terrible situation with him in North Melbourne, just never worked out. But what are your thoughts on those two? Is it worth potentially gambling on one of these at F4, or is it, we've got so many options like Toby McLean's, Ben King's, Flanders, Windhager, all those guys, Philippou even at 160k for St Kilda, that it's not worth it to take up a F4 spot with one of these guys?
It could be worth it. In Ben Long's case, that last game of the season sort of perks the interest a bit. And with Weller out and Powell gone, at least for a few rounds.
And Bowles gone as well.
Yeah. They're
true.
They don't have too much in the way of half-back flankers. So he could start the year off hot. Definitely not a bad option in that regard. I'm just not sure how good he is in terms of like disposal efficiency and all that. He seems like a tough nut player.
Yeah, no.
When you want the unnecessarily.
Yeah, as a St Kilda supporter, I know that he was one of the more frustrating players. He tried hard, but I guess he really wasn't played in the half-back line until late, and then that's where he kind of flourished. He was played predominantly in his career as basically a pressure forward who was a hard nut, and that's where he got half his suspensions from. But yeah, definitely seeing him in the half-back line, I think that's where a lot of St Kilda supporters got a bit pissed off, because we all knew that he was a capable player, and he definitely showed against Sydney. And Sydney's not an easy forward line, and he did it so well. And like reflecting his scoring, I think he had a ridiculous amount of double-digit intercept marks. He just dominated that game, and he was on fire. So yeah, he's one that I guess with a new club, who knows? But there is that risk that it's a new club, and you just don't know what he's capable of at a new environment.
Yeah, I think he's one certainly to watch, but one you'd probably want to be getting out of ASAP when Weller and Powell return.
Yeah.
As for Horne-Francis, I'm not very hot on the pick, to be honest. He's one of those players that probably needs to get like 27 touches or so to average 100 or so, which is a bit steep considering how many Port midfielders there are there that want the ball. So for me, probably a pass as well. We spoke about some of the midfielders that are ahead of him, and he can play forward a bit as well, Horne-Francis. So I think he needs to average about 85 to 90 points to be a good pick at that price. And I think that's going to be a lot harder for him to do as like a half-forward flank midfielder than Ben Long, who might have the monopoly on the back flank.
Yeah.
So for me, he's probably a pass, but he should definitely see an uptick in that average to maybe 75, 80, but that's not going to make you enough money to warrant starting him. So for me, pass.
Yeah, and as I said, we don't know what the midfield combination looks like at Port. And I can't see Lyons, Horne-Francis, another heavy body in there like a Trav Boak. It just won't work. I mean, they're known to be, and as I commented, being one dimension in their midfield, and it looks so much better with Rozee going in through that midfield more predominantly. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, obviously, Horne-Francis wanted to go home for family reasons, but if he was offered or enticed by a chance of playing full-time mid, we just don't know, I guess. And as you said, a fully fit Lycett is obviously a big bonus for Port because of his ability to ruck well, better than whatever they had last year. But yeah, still too hard to say. But yeah, finally moving on to our final verses for this series. This was brought to our attention by one of people who commented on our social media Twitter post. Wanted a heads up on Warple versus Ashcroft. Obviously, we haven't touched on rookies quite yet. We'll get to that in due course. But head-to-head against Warple, who obviously we basically non-existent last year, fell out of favour of the side. But now with O'Meara out, does that basically give him a new chance or a new lease on his midfield career, priced at a very cheaply price in comparison? Do you reckon it's worth A, either giving him a spot entirely, or B, if you have the 100k extra, do you risk not having Ashcroft and playing it completely different to what most people would have and saying stuff that Warple's got runs on the board as a midfielder, and you think that he can actually outscore Ashcroft, or do you think Ashcroft is someone like a Dacos where he may have his low games, but at a rookie price, he's just too good to miss? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's not really much of a comparison. You need Ashcroft in there over Warple for sure. Warple was in my team throughout stages of the preseason, but yesterday when they had their preseason match, apparently he was quite underwhelming. He butchered the ball, turned it over a bit. And for me, that sort of signifies a few things. A, that's not good SuperCoach scoring. And B, will Mitchell want him in there for long periods of time if his disposal efficiency isn't up to scratch? So those sort of doubts have me really concerned with Warple as a pick. So for me, I will probably pass up on Warple unless he somehow manages to clean up that disposal efficiency in the next 2 weeks. I don't know how he's going to do that, but he's one where it could work out as a pick, but with some of the other mid-price options like Sheed and Hopper, obviously, and some of the other options you can get in other lines, like, for instance, some of the other forwards we've discussed and defenders like Yo, for instance, and Hunter Clark, I find it hard to fit Warple in as well, especially because I don't know how good Hawthorn's midfield will be. It's probably the weakest, so it's going to be hard for him to get like a lot of handball receives or hardball gets if other teams' midfielders are getting first hand to it. And if his disposal efficiency is terrible as well, it just goes badly. So for me, he's probably a pass. But do you think Warple could enter your team at any stage over the next few weeks?
Nah, I don't think so at all. I think I've got enough mid prices as it is. I'm trying to avoid having too many mid prices at that price point. Obviously, got Hopper at 320, which is not, you can afford that pretty easily. And obviously, Elliot Yeo is a lock in my side at this current stage with, that. And I think even if, say, you drop a Yeo or a Hopper, I mean, maybe not a Hopper, but say Yeo is more likely to drop because of any injury concerns, I think you can redeploy that money elsewhere rather than upgrading to a Warple from an Ashcroft or an even cheaper rookie. I think it's just not worth it. You've got better options in the other lines that can score better than him. And as you said, I think Hawthorn is going to struggle a lot this year with rebuilding, and Sicily is literally the only player, and what's his face?
McKenzie.
McKenzie, but who's the guy that we just spoke about
Dylan
20 minutes ago? Yeah, Dylan Moore. Those are the only two realistically that scored premium numbers last year. And I just think they're going to blood youth as much as possible. And I think Warple, whilst, who knows, with the absence of O'Meara, could really step up and take that midfield spot on his own. Obviously, Titch is not there anymore, so who knows? Points have to go somewhere. So he could be one that is beneficiary. But as I said, the preseason will tell us a lot. And if he I think the only way I'm going to take him is if he scores consistently or in both preseasons minimum of 90. I think that's probably the way I want to take him, because I can't, obviously, watching preseason games, I think a tip moving forward, and we might mention this closer in once we actually see the preseason games, that a lot of people get suckered in that they see guys like a Jaden Short get 150, but realistically, you got to temper expectations, and that's pretty much a 100 in a regular game. That's all we got time for. Moving forward, we've only got a couple weeks left until the preseason, or obviously next week until first round of preseason games. I believe they start next Thursday, Friday, if I'm not mistaken. And then obviously the week after that, they've got another round of more official preseason games. Obviously, round one's after that, so it's not long to go. And hopefully most people's teams are well underway. But yeah, moving forward, I think we'll be planning to do a review of people's teams they send through in one video, and obviously our rookie review is not too far around the corner. They're pretty much ready for round one. Hopefully all our teams are sorted by then. But what we'll be doing, I guess, in the next week or so before the next podcast, we'll be releasing our group code, which we did similar to last year, which I'm sorting out currently at the moment. So that'll be out officially by next week. It'll probably be out on the socials earlier. But until then, we'll catch you for the next one.